Hello, and welcome to the Skylight Books podcast. My name is Elodie, and I'm thrilled to have Danzy Senna here today to discuss her latest novel, Colored Television. Danzy is the author of 5 previous books, including the best-selling Caucasia and, most recently, New People. The recipient of numerous awards and honors, Danzy currently teaches writing at the University of Southern California. My first impression when I first read Danzy Senna's writing was that she was willing to make her readers deeply uncomfortable. Her protagonists have no problem speaking plainly. They often voice, aloud or to themselves, their most revealing thoughts. Jane, a biracial novelist and professor living in Los Angeles, and the protagonist of Colored Television, is no different. When we first meet Jane, she is about to finally finish her great American novel, a tome on the history of the mulatto people. She's been on sabbatical to write the book, what she hopes will be her ticket out of an unsteady, quasi-middle class life. Jane and her family are living in a borrowed house, they're house sitting for a wealthy screenwriter friend, on what feels like borrowed time. When her agent rejects the novel, panic and hilarity ensue. Colored Television is a biting and entertaining satire that deftly probes our obsession with identity. It's full of lines that made me laugh aloud and thrilled me with their boldness. It's also about that ever so lofty American dream, the difficulties of parenting and creative persistence. Jane struggles to balance it all, aware that money will grant her, quote, the home she needed to raise her children and to do what she wanted to do, which was to tell her story and age richly. Thank you so much, Danzy, for being here. I would love for you to start with a reading from the book, and then we'll chat.
Thank you so much for having me and that wonderful introduction. I'm going to read from chapter 2. Jane first met Lenny at a house party in Brooklyn. He'd come on the arm of another woman. Jane had come alone. She'd been just emerging from a bad breakup, the latest in a string of them. She was not usually the sort of woman to go after another woman's man, and she might not have done so had it not been for the psychic. Not that she believed in psychics, not now, not then, but the first session had been an early birthday gift from her sister, who had a long relationship with the occult. Jane found the psychic soothing voice over the phone comforting. His name was Wesley Brown. On his website, he had not actually used the word psychic. Instead, he had called himself an intuitive psychodynamic counselor with a specialty in racial alchemy. In their first session, he told Jane that her future husband was on his way, nearly there. The way he said it, with a kind of bemused certainty, made Jane understand why her sister liked him so much. He was more fun than a therapist. Across the room at the party, a Black man was standing at the chip table alone, shoveling corn chips with salsa into his mouth. He was wearing Vans sneakers and a t-shirt that said, "Part of the problem." What was it that the psychic had predicted? He'd said Jane was about to meet a Black man who was funny, a Black man who would be wearing West Coast shoes. The Vans were definitely West Coast, and the t-shirt was funny, pretty funny. She sidled over, drink in hand. "Do you live around here?" she asked. "Brooklyn? No, I hate Brooklyn. People here are pigs." She asked him where he lived instead. "Nowhere, really." He wiped the chip grease off his mouth with a cocktail napkin. "I'm staying in LA for now. I hate it there too. Different breed of pigs." They introduced themselves. They got into a strange, joking discussion, she didn't remember how, about ice cream. Lenny said a person's choice in ice cream was influenced by their race. He said that Chinese people tended to like pistachio. White people like sloppy flavors like Rocky Road or anything with a lot of chunks in it. And Black people liked clean and tidy flavors like mint chocolate chip. Were they flirting? She couldn't tell. His eyes roamed the room occasionally as if he were looking for someone else. Jane was trying to think what else to say to interest this man when a woman appeared beside him. She slid her arm through his, kissed his cheek territorially, gave Jane a cutting look, then whispered something in his ear. So he was taken. Jane found herself surprised by the presence of the woman who had not been in the psychic's prediction. She found herself scanning the room for a different Black man, a second funny Black man in West Coast shoes, but there was nobody, only miles of white writers and a few racially ambiguous mystery meat types like herself. When she looked back at Lenny and the woman, they were speaking to each other in low lover tones, as if she weren't there, and she felt her throat catch. She felt as if she were already involved with this guy, as if she were already his mistress. Jane had been in New York for 10 years at that point. She'd moved there after college, still believing that her life would unfold in a certain order. First, she would launch her career. Then, after a series of difficult but teachable moment love affairs, she would meet the one, her future mate, and settle down somewhere outside the city where they would spawn beautiful, gifted children. Later, when said children grew up and went to college at a school that looked exceptionally good on a bumper sticker on her Audi, Jane would spend the rest of her days writing novels and tending to her yard in Eileen Fisher clothes, her face set in deep thought, like a kind of Pema Chodron for the biracial set. She would age gracefully as a rich Buddhist. But it had not happened that way. The night she met Lenny, she'd already reached that Didion-esque moment when her life in the city began to feel repetitive, stunted. As her 33rd birthday loomed, she found she'd lost interest in dating altogether. The parties all began to look alike. She was no longer able to remember why she'd broken up with her previous boyfriend. She'd gotten to the part of the story where she began to circle back, calling exes late at night to see if they wanted to get back together. By then, she had quite a number of ex-boyfriends, a spade of them, some boys, some men, relationships that had each lasted long enough for them to take off the condom. Her married sister always said serial monogamy was like being a slow cooker hoe. And Jane had the medical records to think maybe her sister was right. A few infections, nothing fatal or permanent, a malformed cell on her cervix that she had needed to have burned off, something else that required a tube of antibiotic cream squeezed inside of her. The perils of the journey. Many of the men had wanted to settle down with Jane, but she hadn't been ready. In her 20s, she had wanted nothing to do with domesticity, and this not wanting had made her the target of several good men. Looking back, it seemed she'd spent the decade dodging engagement rings flung at her across taxi seats. She'd wanted to stay a precocious girl woman, to tend to her own needs forever. She had been satisfied with the performance of marriage without the ring, the rising action of discontent, the falling action of the breaking up, the escape to freedom before the story started all over again. For so long, she'd found her own foibles interesting. But now, on the cusp of 33, everything had started to look different. The suitors had stopped throwing the rings at her, for one thing. When she called them late at night, one by one over the course of the year, she'd learned that somebody else had caught those flying rings. Kamau told her with delight that he was expecting his first baby with a filmmaker named Shari. Chino told her that he was in love with an Irish girl and moving to Dublin. Farouk told her he was now happily living with somebody named Gavin. Benjamin told her that he was still in love with her, but his therapist had helped him to see all the ways she was a narcissist. He said he needed to go no contact. She'd even called Colton, the last of the white boys, the one with the scratchy lumberjack beard, who told her that he had moved upstate with someone named Susan. Jane wished them all well. After she hung up, she stared at the dried flower arrangement on her mantel that looked like kindling for a fire, a design trick she'd learned from Domino magazine. She wanted what the exes had or were about to get: a child on the way, a mortgage to pay, a Volvo, a pile of laundry that needed washing. That same year, a catalog showed up in her mailbox for Hannah Anderson, a Swedish-inspired clothing company out of Oregon she'd never heard of before. They mostly sold children's clothes, but there was sleepwear for adults too. The catalog was addressed to the roommate who had moved out a long time ago. Jane was about to throw it in the trash when the picture on the cover caught her eye. A family of 4 were wearing matching striped pajamas and laughing. A medium brown-skinned black man and a beautiful brown-skinned black woman with high cheekbones. The 2 of them flanked by a perfectly adorable boy and girl of the same skin tone. Jane went to the couch and began flipping through the catalog. The same kids modeled the clothes inside. In a few images, they appeared with their quasi-parents too. Jane's mouth watered as she stared at the shots of them lounging around a swimming pool in matching bathing suits. In another photo, the mother and daughter walked on the beach holding hands in matching mother-daughter sundresses. They were all of them always smiling, perpetually on the verge of laughter. What was so funny, Jane wanted to know. She kept the catalog beside her bed for months, and when she was not looking at it, she'd think of the family inside with a peculiarly intense longing. She thought of them when she was standing shivering on the subway platform in Brooklyn in her combat boots, or on her way to a party in her giant parka, or even while at a party staring at the faces of her drunken, bellowing friends, or when she was out on a date with that white hedge fund guy who had Tourette syndrome and between courses erupted with dirty cunt, words he didn't mean. She'd been pre-warned about his pick by her friends who had set them up. She'd perused the catalog at night alone in bed when she was tired, so tired, gazing, unblinking at the Black family who were exploding together with joy. She called her mother one night and confessed something shameful. She wanted to settle down, have a few kids, live in the suburbs. Her mother, the aging beatnik, perpetually single, said that she couldn't believe she'd raised a daughter who had such bourgeois restoration hardware fantasies. Wasn't it ironic, she said, how women spent their 20s trying to catch a man and have his babies, then spent the next decade wishing they could escape through a bathtub drain. Settling down was just a euphemism for inching toward death. Death was the ultimate form of settling down. She said Jane should pine to create great art instead, because in the end, men were letdowns and kids were disappointments who grew up, like Jane and her sister, to blame their mothers for everything. Only art and friendship remained. Jane hung up and called her sister, who told her their mother was full of white feminist second-wave claptrap, that she'd always cared more about feeding her own ego than feeding her half-caste children. Don't you remember how awful it was for us growing up, Jane? Don't you remember what we went through? Don't listen to her, Jane. She's toxic. That was when her sister said that what Jane needed was a psychic. There was this guy, a friend of a friend from college, who had predicted her own husband in a roundabout way. Now he was a psychic to the stars. He'd set Jane straight.
Great. Thank you so much, Danzy. That is definitely one of my favorite scenes in the novel. So many moments that just make me laugh aloud. And what I appreciate about this book and your sense of the humor that comes from this book is that you come for everybody, right? Black, white, Nigerian, gay, straight, and I think it really speaks to how this question of identity or our relationship to identity has really filtered through our consciousness and is something that we just can't stop thinking about or talking about. And it still to this day frames so much of how we think of ourselves and other people. So my first question for you is, what made you want to write a satire?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I have felt that all of my books had an element of humor to them. And, I was a class clown as a child. My impulse is often to find the humor in things that are kind of taboo or that are kind of seen as serious topics. And, I think I get that from my family. We were kind of competitive about humor growing up. And my father in particular, really had a very dark sense of humor about race and culture and class. And I think I adopted that from him. but I don't know if it's a satire. Like, it's just, to me, it's in a way a kind of realism that I've just cut to the funny parts, and it's just cutting out the parts that aren't funny and letting those other things sort of exist and be accentuated by the white space around them. But to me, all of this stuff
Yeah,
is
and
funny. But the best humor is really like undercut by other emotions. There's nothing kind of interesting to me about funny for funny's sake, but like the sort of contradictory feelings beneath the humor are really interesting to me in terms of anger or sadness or anxiety in particular.
definitely, and something that I was thinking about a lot is how underneath Jane's humor, it feels like she's really just seeking security and safety. And I think that's something that, of course, we all seek in different ways, but for her, it feels especially salient, I think, with her relationship to her own identity and how she sees herself. And I feel like this is a motif in some of your other work, but this idea of a protagonist who is biracial, who has trouble seeing themselves. Like they'll look in the mirror and kind of feel like they're disappearing. And yeah, where do you think that instinct in Jane comes
Yeah,
from?
Jane, there's sort of a recurring thing where she kind of can't find herself in mirrors, or she's searching for mirrors and they're not there, or she's just literally not there, like in a very strange, surreal way. And I'm always interested in the over um, representation of mixed people in our public life, and yet the sort of invisibility of the stories that go with those faces, and that sort of beige skin that we see in all these movies and commercials, and that sort of has all this sort of fetishization of that look, but that actually the reality and the complexity of what that perspective is seems like sort of really cut out from the story of this country, and has been from the very beginning um, the thing that was erased from the story, literally from the antebellum South, when the actual fact of people's mixture was taken out of the paternity and the story, the dark story of that paternity of all these mixed children on the plantation is erased from the story. But I think that persists in a strange way, that we don't hear that perspective, not in a kind of cloying and sentimental way, like, here's Tiger Woods saying he's Cablinasian, but in a way that really gets to all of the sort of ridiculousness of race, and also the harm of it, of the culture we live in, and all of the contradictions of being someone who is of mixed race, but often, we have identities that are more complex than even saying mixed would suggest. Um, so I'm interested in how there's like overrepresentation and then a strange gap in the story.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's what so much of the story is about, just in terms of Jane trying to construct this TV show that will please this executive and please Hollywood and entertainment. And what you said about Tiger Woods reminds me of, just makes you think of, I think there's something around Obama as well and his election and this idea of multiculturalism, right? And I feel like for the past 10 years, we've been hearing this statistic of by 2050, or by 2050, 30 or X% of the United States will be a person of color, and kind of that being something to admire, but also feels really vague and
Super
something that
vague.
I feel like
Yeah,
has
I
just,
don't even know
yeah,
what a
so
person of
vague.
color is, to be honest. I'm always like,
Right.
what is
Yeah. And
BIPOC? I mean, can we just be specific here? Which is partly why I
yes.
sort of reclaim the word mulatto in here, because the word biracial is entirely meaningless to me. I don't know which two two races you're talking about, and they have very different histories depending on what, but the history of being black and white in America is so specific and so much defines me and everyone I know, that like I kind of need to embrace a word that not only is specific to that, but also holds the entire twisted history of what that means. Doesn't sanitize it and turn it into science, and actually acknowledges, even implicit in the word, that it's a construction.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, in your own research for the book, how much you knew about the history of mulattoes in this country? Because, yeah, of course, it's what Jane, it's part of her big, great American novel that she set out to write. But how much did you know, and what were you surprised by in your research?
I mean, I thought I knew everything there was to know about mulattoes because I've been sort of studying this subject in every single way for many, many, many years, and it's been a sort of interest of mine in terms of academic reading and novels and the representation of mixed people. But the thing that sort of surprised me as I was working on this was I came across this essay that was part of a book that was by this white sociologist, and it was a study of mixed race people. And it's different from, I used that idea in the book where you see this voice coming in, that's the white sociologist from the 30s talking about what he's found in his studies of mixed people. But I decided to write it as fiction, but it was based on this real document that I discovered while I was working on this book. And I could not believe this sort of gold mine I had stumbled on, which was a sociological study of mulattoes from the 1930s. And it was so depressing and so dark and so awful. And yet funny to me, as these things often are. The comedy of it.
And and part of the narrative too is the story of I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but the
Melungeon. Yes.
Melungeon people. Yeah, I would love for you to just say a little bit more about that, which it is, like you're saying, such a dark, fascinating story.
This was these communities. They were called triracial isolates. That's the sociological term for these communities that formed in the sort of post-Reconstruction South and in Appalachia, different parts of the country. There were these groups, and they were a mixture of Black Americans, indigenous people, and white people that created their own communities and were sort of mysterious to everyone else. And they sort of blended together these three races, and there were all sorts of mythology around them and fear of them because they were unknown to everyone. Who were these strange kind of bronze colored people? And so I was reading histories of the Melungeons, and I was reading sociological texts on mulattoes that were really offensive, and kind of seeping myself in that history and that kind of representation that I was writing against, actually, in this novel. And it was really kind of fun to have kind of a historical text to bounce off of and to kind of work in contrast to.
Do you think you would ever write that historical epic?
I mean, it sounds like I've been asked that before, because Jane nearly loses her mind. She loses all her money for 10 years writing this 400-page historical novel about the mulatto people. And I always think it's funny when people are like, would you write that? And I'm like, are you crazy? I'm not going to write that novel. I want to have a different path from Jane if I can help it. But it does sound like, could be interesting.
Totally. Well, when did you start writing the book, and how did the idea come about?
I actually started it before the pandemic, and it was this terrible thing where I was, moving, really enjoying it. It was moving along, and then the pandemic happened, and my kids were home from school. We were like, is the world ending? And I put it in a drawer for many, many, many months, and just didn't touch it because I was too busy kind of helping my family navigate this moment. And when I went back to it, I was afraid it wouldn't catch again, that I wouldn't be able to get back into it. And I actually found myself laughing at the first 100 pages, and I was like, actually, I want to keep going with this. But I think I was just really interested in art making and the sort of despair of trying to create art into a culture that finds you illegible. And that was, you know, I had done some, an essay about Fran Ross, who wrote Oreo. And I remember, she was a comic Black woman novelist who, wrote in the 70s, and her book just sort of bombed, and she moved to Hollywood to try to find a place for her voice. And I was thinking about how, that feeling of being the sort of wrong voice at the wrong time, the wrong perspective for the culture, and that you sort of search for a place that gets you. And as someone who tends to write, ironic, and I write from a kind of racial non-binary place, have often felt sort of like the culture wasn't getting me, and I was being misread. So I was interested in and having lived in LA for so long, in exploring like someone moving into another genre and trying to write for Hollywood, and the capitalism and the sense of hope and mania in Hollywood was really interesting to me. And I had dabbled in it a bit,
Yeah.
and sort of had a little taste of it. So that was all I needed to go running with it.
Yeah, this is also a great LA novel. It's so nice to see a more contemporary representation, and yeah, just a representation I haven't seen, and that feels very welcome. And and even just sort of the kind of Easter eggs, the house that Jane lives in, and all of these things that are specific to LA. And I think it's really interesting that you sort of took a break during the pandemic, because I mean, what a time for the industry to change. And I think, and just sort of on a more personal note, like I moved out to LA in 2018. Wow. And yeah, and I feel like I came honestly at the tail end of sort of the latest big diversity bubble. And I started my career in the mailroom, and I think it's really interesting how I've already seen, in basically the time that I've been in LA, which is 6 years, a rise, and then what I really think is a fall, and just at least by the trailers I'm seeing. Like, I don't know if it's a complete fall, but it definitely feels like there's been another shift.
It's kind of interesting because that sort of tracks with the novel's sort of tone of like hysteria, and like I got to jump onto this diversity bubble before the white people get bored of race. And then like the sort of, where I won't give too much away, but like where Hampton Ford, the producer, ends, like, in the novel. And I think that's really true, that this was something that I began in the kind of glory days of the diversity push of Hollywood. And by the time I finished, that was long over. And, it's happened in the publishing world too, like that sort of Robin DiAngelo hysteria that came over white liberal America. And then the sort of firings began, and the like, let's undo this now. I think they're over it. I think we can get rid of this. So I was interested in, the break I took and seeing the world differently after the pandemic. And so the novel probably has some of that in it too. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's great that you don't only get at entertainment, but publishing as well, which operate very similarly, like you just mentioned, in these sort of, it feels like cycles of awareness, and then maybe cooling off.
Yeah. And are you the race of the month or not? Are you the race they want this month? And I think being mixed race and being sort of racially, as they use that word, illegible, it's been interesting for me. I've been publishing since my first novel in the 90s, Caucasia, and really the sort of way that there's a very specific way that you're looked upon by that world if you are neither nor, and a sense that we're trying to pick shelves to put you on, and we don't actually know which shelf to put you on, and you're harder to kind of brand, and we may not be getting diversity points from you if we publish you, because are you really a person of color or not? Like, I've dealt with this my whole career as a writer, the sort of confusion that meets you. And also writing as a kind of person who writes funny about race or writes towards the comedy of race. There's a desire in these industries for a more somber tone and a more earnest tone, and especially if you're a woman, you're supposed to not write ironic. You're supposed to write trauma. um, so I mean, and all of that was stuff that I kind of wanted to write about. All of those pressures on writers of color and creators of color, and that are, I think, maybe, if you are not in a quote marginalized group, you don't face, you don't think about even.
I mean, that sounds so difficult, and what you're saying about your own experience and someone like Fran Ross too is, I think of, there's a line that Lenny says in the book about how Black genius isn't recognized and valued in this country, and how there's a long history of writers who have been, deeply disappointed, haven't been seen, and people who've had to leave. I think of even someone like Baldwin, who, not mixed race, but, tried to do the Hollywood thing, but got rejected for it. And, I think there's this, anyone who's quote unquote marginalized, like, has to face this, again, automatic whiteness, right, as the default. And then, God forbid that there's more nuance to your experience. Like, it's
and I think
there feels like there's no room for that.
No, I think Lenny speaks to that. But I kind of, always knew that the book was going to be funny and wasn't going to feel heavy. Like, I wanted there to be, sometimes when I'm writing a novel, like, I see colors and I see shapes more than it's almost like I'm looking at a painting. And I felt like this one had to be very bright and kind of effervescent, even as all these heavy questions were underlying this book. I wanted it to kind of feel deceptively light in a way, because it felt like humor is where I go to feel free, and irony, and I like thinking about things sideways rather than directly.
It feels like that description really fits the cover, which I love. Like, it feels very well suited to the book. And speaking of humor, I was wondering if there were any comedians or other works that you were thinking about when working on the book. I think your work is just now in a long tradition of American humorists. Like, I think of people like Richard Pryor and Mark Twain, and people who are really using humor to try to understand who we are as Americans. Like that, it's really about the question of who are we, and how can we understand one another. So I'd love to know some of your sources.
Yeah, I feel like all the comedians that I love have been canceled. And so I'm like, wait, I mean, some of them I've personally canceled in my heart, and some of them have been canceled by the culture. But, like, that's the risk of comedy too, is that you're gonna burn some people or step on toes. And I like, you mentioned Richard Pryor, and I love him. But I grew up listening. This ages me, but I grew up listening to comedy on vinyl. My siblings and I, when we were kids, would listen to Eddie Murphy, and I was completely in love with Eddie Murphy as a child. And we listened to Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin, and these were like, just something about these comedians just spoke so deeply to my sense of the truth and reality and freedom, to be able to make things hilarious like that. And so I also think that humor is a way that you sort of create a sense of connection in a group. Like, these are the jokes in this book. Like, not everyone is going to understand every reference I make, and when you do understand it, you understand you're part of the same world as the person speaking, and that's really powerful. So comedy, I don't think of it, it's not a conscious choice, it's just where I tend to go, as anyone who knows me can attest to. Like, it's my kids are constantly like, "Are you serious about anything, mom?" You know, because it's constant. Like, I feel it's the only gift I can give them is to like teach them how to be funny. I'm not good
Mm.
with the math homework, but like I can point something out to them and we can laugh about it.
I mean, I think it's such a skill, right? It's like being able to disarm other
Yeah,
people, like humor automatically, I think, makes people relax, makes people, at least physically, you can't be tense when you're
that's so
laughing,
true.
especially if you're laughing really hard. Like, in fact, sometimes like things are released,
So
like if
true.
you get too,
Yeah,
like,
and I
yeah.
think like the thing is that the joke is always on some level on myself. Like, I may be skewering all those groups you mentioned at the beginning or all those people, and but like I think Jane is the one who the biggest joke is of all, and so it's kind of a jujitsu, I think, where you're kind of like when you've had sort of a lot of hostility toward you in your life. I think one of the most powerful things is to be able to laugh at yourself before the others laugh at you, and to kind of be able to point out the flaw in yourself. It's actually a very powerful defense strategy, and survival strategy. And my dad grew up in Jim Crow South, and like is one of the funniest people I know on the subject of race. Um, and I think that's been true with a lot of oppressed groups. Is the humor that comes out of that is always really interesting and a strategy as much as just a reflex.
Mhm. And I'm curious how working on this book, did it illuminate anything for you about your own relationship to like this question of identity or identity politics and maybe
Mm.
language?
I mean, I think this book more than any other I've written, I've sort of allowed myself to go toward the comedy. I didn't hold back with it. But I think the funny thing about novels is it takes years for me anyway to understand what I was actually writing about. I can tell you now something that I think I was writing about, but what I love about fiction writing is that your subconscious always knows more than your conscious mind, and that um, years later you'll say, "Oh, I was really writing about marriage," or "I was really writing about." Um, Sort of some sexual thing, but you didn't realize it at the time, and it was hidden in the text. And so it's sort of always uncovering itself to you over time. And so I kind of feel like I'm so close to this still that I can't tell you what surprised me, but I know it will become clear to me.
Interesting, interesting. Um, I read in another interview that music tends to be a big part of your process for writing. I'm curious if color television had a
Oh,
soundtrack.
that's such a
What
good
would
question.
the songs on it?
There was a lot of songs, and it was different parts of the novel, but I was at one point listening to I think Lenny calls it belly rubbing music, like Switch and DeBarge, and these kind of like 70s and 80s R&B soul songs. And then um Whitney Houston is a big figure, even though she doesn't appear much in this book, but there's a section where they're staying in the hotel where she died. And she's someone, if I was to do a soundtrack for this, I would put a Whitney Houston song on. And then I would say some really women hip hop, women rappers like Mulatto, for instance, who I still call Mulatto, but she goes by Lotto because she was bullied out of using the name. Um, and all those just kind of like slightly in your face rappers. Megan and Cardi B and all of those might be there too, just because I like things that have a little bit of a comedy and attitude at the same time.
That definitely feels right for this. And the cover, like it's very vibrant and I don't know why, but purple is always a color that I associate with like Black femininity. And yeah,
That's
I
from
don't,
Alice
so it just
Walker, The Color
feels,
Purple.
yes, of
She
course,
says
yes,
that
of course, yes. See,
I think it's feminism is lavender is to feminism as
mhm,
purple is to womanism. I think, yeah, if I'm
exactly,
remembering
yes.
correctly.
Yes. No, that's exactly what I was trying to
Yeah,
think of, and which also feels apt because I think deep down too, like there is so much about being a working mother and what it means to hold on to your creative pursuits, to she's been working on this book for 10 years. In the meantime, has had two children, and there's so much there about class and what wealth gives you in terms of options as a woman
yes.
and a mother and stability and creative freedom. And that also feels like, in line with the
Oh,
womanist
yeah.
principle or
And I
this
was
idea.
very much like raised by that ethos as a child, and those women were all a part of my life as a child. And I am really interested, and I was raised by, my mother's a poet, and all of the women who raised me were creative people. And that's a real struggle. And being a novelist in and of itself is a hard thing to be committed to over a lifetime, because it's a thing that doesn't sort of hit the sort of capitalist marketplace, and there's sort of no practical use for it, and it's a very hit or miss thing to do. It's a risk. And if you're a woman and a mother, everything you're going to be told that everything else is more important than your little creative thing that you're incubating alone in the dark. And so I think to have faith in that as a woman, as a Black woman, as a woman of color, you're going against everything the culture is telling you that you should be doing instead. And I think Jane has some people supporting her as an artist. Her husband is actually wants her to create this work and wants her to stay true to her vision, which I think goes against some of the stereotypes of what that marriage would be. Um, but in the end, it's like her who loses faith in it and sort of hears those voices of the white publishing world and you know steps away from the work and doesn't trust in it.
Mm. Yeah, I love that representation of a husband who is so down for their partner's creativity, and it's yeah, so it's so rare to see a portrait of what it looks like for a Black family to try to create,
Yeah.
and who don't necessarily aren't silver spoon kids
Yeah.
or don't are figuring it out. And yeah, and I'm so happy that, this book exists and that, you were able to write it, and I feel like you're embodying, a lot of what you're speaking. So I'm just so happy the work is out there because it made me laugh, but again, has so much complicated truth in it, which is such a fine line to walk, but really wonderful, and it feels
That makes me happy that you had that reading of it. And we're always sort of trying to write ourselves into existence. When you walk around the world and you don't see representations of anything that resembles you, I think part of the artistic impulse is to fill in the picture that's missing something. And so since I began writing, that's been kind of my impulse, but it's been different pictures I've been trying to put out into the world that go against what I'm seeing in some ways. And this family was kind of maybe the original idea I had, was trying to write this family into existence, because I knew this family, but they weren't out there in the world being shown.
Exactly, exactly. Well, soon people will be able to meet this wonderful, hilarious family that I definitely fell in love with. But thank you so
Thank
much,
you. This was great.
Danzy, for coming on the podcast. And yeah, you'll be able to get the book at Skylight. And yeah, we're so excited to have people buy it and check it out.
Great. Me too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.